Comrades and friends, this is a night when really so many thousands of people are in the streets, and literally so many of us here have been out with them, and others not here are still marching. So in any talk on the U.S. support for terrorist forces around the world, the first thing we need to do is address what is terror right here at home. What is the police terror? And the mass terror by the police in the U.S. today, it's really one police killing, a black and brown and all too often disabled people, a day. It's actually about 1 every 8 hours. 1,000 people a year are victims of police killings. It's a scale beyond anywhere else in the world. And even when you think of the terrorist bombings going on around the world, and then you look at the scale of police murders and also people who become disabled through police attacks and incarcerated. But the literal scale of police murders, it's because this is a state that is built on the use of racist terror. And it's important to acknowledge that at every turn. The largest prison population on the planet. Now, today, talking about Teamster worker Philandro Castile, who was killed by cops in Minneapolis, and 37-year-old Alton Sterling at the hands of the Baton Rouge police. Actually caught on video, cell phone video, and it shows them tackling Sterling, taking him to the ground, no resistance, and shot 5 times. I mean, it's hard to, the rage that this has created, the video coverage of it really shows there's no way they can talk their way around this, and yet it's refused to be acknowledged, and we know how often the police just simply get off. Delron Dempsey, East New York, Brooklyn, shot on July 4th by a racist off-duty police. I call it road rage. Police rage, really. And so the demonstrations are really saying that the only way to fight racist terror, and this is being raised increasingly, is the demand to dismantle the police state. And that's what it is, a police state. The names, and they're now famous around the world, of Michael Brown and Eric Garner and Tamir Rice and Sandra Bland, hundreds more. And keeping these names and the recognition of these crimes at the front of our agenda, because it's the biggest problem facing the working class in the U.S. today. This is the #1 problem. It's racism. It's the attacks on immigrants, the attacks on Muslims. It is absolutely part of the climate, and it's not a mistake. It's not a misunderstanding. It is a policy. And it's the role of the state and the police and the military and the courts and the whole prison industrial complex. It's the role of the corporate media. And recognizing that and looking at everything through that prism, that is increasingly important. Now, U.S. imperialism is a global capitalist empire, and it is today in serious decline and decay. The whole rotten capitalist system is today extremely fragile, on the edge of collapse. And every vicious tool that capitalism used in its ascendancy, when it was rising to a superpower, every crime, from slavery to lynch law to Jim Crow, to the genocide of the indigenous population, to the use of nuclear weapons, to carpet bombing in Vietnam and Korea, every crime that they committed, they're more than willing to use in a desperate attempt to maintain their declining position. And that's why it's important to always remember their crimes going on right now around the world and their past crimes, and never let the memory of these crimes go. because this is what they've used before and what they are all too willing to use again. They will use racism and manufacture division. It's how they rose to power, and it was never through democracy or respect for the rule of law or concern about human rights. And it is the biggest problem not only facing us here, but facing the working class on a global scale. Racism, sectarian and religious differences, national antagonisms, these are really being used as consciously as a weapon of class war by the ruling class. The working class today is really a class on a global scale in a way that it's never been before, and increasingly in touch with each other. So the problem for the ruling class is how to hide this growing consciousness, which is all pervasive. And so attempting to use national antagonism and blaming immigrants and blaming Muslims and pushing for division of Sunni from Shia or Hindu from Muslim and Muslim of Christian, and so we could go on and on and on, but it is a conscious policy, and it is meant to hide the class in itself on a global scale, and workers having a consciousness of themselves as a class. Now, just think of the past few weeks, I mean, really days, and the terror attacks, Bangladesh, Turkey, the hundreds dead in Iraq, and in a whole number of different bombings of crowded marketplaces, people celebrating the end of Ramadan in the markets, the daily attacks going on in Syria, bombings, Yemen, in Brussels, in Paris, in Orlando, in Nigeria. And all of these, we're told, are ISIS or other terrorist organizations that no one understands where they came from or how they arose or what their demands are. See, this is where we need to step back and understand what is the U.S. role in this. And this is without being conspiracy theorists that every single bombing or attack is pre-planned. It's not. But it is when a absolutely reactionary political formation is created and aided and armed and trained and organized on every scale. From there, it rolls forward. And this is what we're seeing today. Now, U.S. imperialism is clearly, it's using what they call ISIS in several ways. It's to attack the secular forces, the forces that offer any kind of resistance to U.S. imperialism in the Middle East. And this is true from Syria to Libya, Lebanon, Yemen, especially Iran. It's become an all-inclusive pretext for U.S. military intervention everywhere, sending troops throughout Africa. AFRICOM is all-pervasive now throughout the whole entire continent, sending troops to Philippines. Almost anywhere in the world today, U.S. bases and troops and forward groups and alliances are all on the basis that this is to combat ISIS. So this is a very important pretext. And it also, the whole, quote, war on terror, is a pretext for maintaining a huge U.S. military here at home. And really kind of fomenting a domestic threat that's being used to justify an enormous expansion of domestic surveillance. Now, just by some estimates, and there's probably estimates that are much higher, but since the, quote, beginning of the war on terror in 2001, the cost of these wars have been more than $6 trillion. And that's probably a modest figure. It's at far higher. But what it means in the human costs, that's enormous. Now, there's a whole number of groupings. It's hard to even keep track of their names, what they are, and it's meant to be confusing and disorienting for people here. But whether it's Al-Qaeda or al-Nusra or the Islamic State, it's a direct result of U.S. arms being sent, especially in an effort to overthrow the government in Syria in the recent period, in the last 5 years. And to use these, what are called jihadist forces, that go by many names, and it's hard to, we don't want to take up and become part of what is an anti-Islam attack, when it's really forces and reactionary forces that the U.S. has had a big role in creating. Now, there was a very interesting interview that Russian President Putin gave last November after Russia finally entered the war in Syria in running finally some bombing campaigns against the forces of ISIS. And he pointed out how the U.S. and 13 other countries, all uninvited, had been engaged in bombing Syria for over a year. And absolutely never managed to even touch any of the gigantic sort of oil sales and delivery apparatus of ISIS that were operating with complete impunity. He said there's a huge facility and transportation system. And then he waved at the news conference. He said, I've shared this with President Obama. These are satellite pictures taken 4,000 meters up of motorcades, 1,000 cars and more oil tankers, 1,000 tankers long. Never touched. All carrying oil from ISIS-held areas directly into Turkey. Borders are open. So, and then the U.S. raised outrage when Russia proceeded to bomb some of these very targets that they said, here's the satellite pictures, you claim you're doing a war against the forces of terror and you're not in any way touching. And when they actually bombed forces of the al-Nusra Front, the U.S. said, why, those are our guys. They're part of the democratic, peaceful revolutionary forces in Syria. They sent up U.S. aircraft to try to push Russian aircraft back, which shows how dangerous and how out of control this can quickly become. But it also shows that the deployment of these terror forces have really become central to U.S. imperial policy in Syria, and not only in Syria. And they blame all the problems on, they say, well, there's poor intelligence, and we have clumsy targeting, and inexperienced planners, and we have staffing shortages, and there's internal rivalries, and we don't always know who's who, and so on and so forth. These are the excuses. But it has allowed a huge apparatus to be created and funded, very well paid and equipped, and flowing in. And they call them freedom fighters and revolutionaries and human rights activists and all of that. But the effort is to bring down the government in Syria. Now, it's a larger scale. One of the emails, famous Hillary Clinton emails, this is very interesting. It shows how far creating an all-out Sunni-Shia war in the region is in the U.S. planning. And it's not only the overthrow of the government in Syria. And she says in a bragging way, this is a Hillary Clinton email, that in the view of Israeli commanders, it would not be a bad thing for Israel and its Western allies, that means the U.S., and its Western allies, this is an all-out Sunni-Shia war, because it might lead to the overthrow of the Islamic Republic of Iran. Now, this really is a height of cynicism, of war crimes on the most enormous level, of using terror and mass murder and war, and saying, well, this wouldn't be such a bad thing. I mean, doesn't this remind you of Madeleine Albright and, you know, the death of 500,000 children would be worth it? So this clearly shows the way they think. Now, there's also, we could look at UN reports that there were large quantities of weapons and ammunition from Libya after the destruction of the government in Libya that were pretty openly smuggled into, and all kinds of new army forces that were created throughout Africa. And it included rocket-propelled grenades and machine guns and anti-aircraft, and automatic rifles and surface-to-air missiles and all kinds of things to arm and finance and fund one of the groups, extremely important, Boko Haram, we hear so much about. And it's really an excuse for U.S. intervention in oil-rich Nigeria. And in order to create a military presence that also is part of pushing back influence, economic influence of China. There's a lot of really cynical maneuvers in all this, but it is the use of the worst forms of division. And this is how U.S. policy operates. And we need to know it's both the police here, but it is the police around the world. I want to just, a couple of other things, just point out. There's the investigative journalist Seymour Hersh, who did a whole series of studies and reports. And he talked about the Obama administration meeting with, you know, Turkey and Saudi Arabia and Qatar in order to set up, at the time he was writing this, was a sarin gas attacks that would be an excuse for U.S. invasion and overthrow. That was in 2012. There was a strong pushback and a determination against U.S. war in Syria. So they went at it again through a more conscious use of the terror forces, and doing this through funding from Turkey and Saudi Arabia and Qatar, along with it being coordinated by the CIA and the British M16 forces, and getting arms from Libya after that state was driven down. And the Seymour Hersh article is important. It's important in this time of election campaign because it also directly implicated Hillary Clinton in the setup and in the positioning of all of this, and in the taking and the shipping of weapons from Libya into these forces in Syria. It's important also, this isn't a new policy. The same article made reference to a whole succession of U.S. attempted and actually carried out coups in Syria over years. The overthrow in 1949. I mean, we're going back quite a while now. Overthrow of the first democratically elected government in Syria. And U.S. instigated coups in 1954 and in 63 and in 66, and finally in 1977, which is when Hafez Assad came into power. So one coup after another, and it was all really to position Syria, interested in a pipeline that would benefit, but the threat of a country having control of its own resources, and the willingness to use military coups, destabilization, and, quote, terrorist forces. Now, the greatest source of this sectarian violence is the U.S. war in Iraq. And we need to be aware that there's a whole generation of activists now who a war 13 years ago is not in their consciousness now, and the impact of that war. And a war 25 years ago, 91 war, and the sanctions, the years of sanctions. How would you know this? If you're a historian, if you're a revolutionary. But for the new activists today, this isn't what they would know or have had any experience with shock and awe and what that meant. Now, it's come up in a big way, though, this past week in Britain. they just released something that was called the Chilcot Report. Now, the Chilcot Report is very interesting. It came from pressure from the anti-war movement 7 years ago in Britain that demanded an inquiry into the British role in the war in Iraq and how that came about. And it was expected that this report would take less than a year. It was a parliamentary inquiry. Well, it ended up that this report took 7 years literally because they sat on it. It grew to 12 volumes. I mean, it's an enormous tome. But in summary, it does say that the war in Iraq was based on no threat, that there were no weapons of mass destruction, that there was no excuse for the war, that it was not justified, that it was not the last resort. Now, do we think that Tony Blair is going to be put on trial for war crimes? There are forces actually in Britain that are calling for this now, based on this report. And we hope they do so with full determination. Actually, all the forces in the Labour Party right now that are trying to get rid of Jeremy Corbyn were those who voted for the war and were absolutely complicit in it. So it's sharpening also a struggle within the Labour Party. And I just want to quote something that Jeremy Corbyn said about the report, and also about this effort at a kind of a Tony Blair-led coup against him, his leadership in the Labour Party. He said the Iraq War was an act of military aggression launched on a false pretext, and it has fueled and spread terrorism across the region. That's important, because it means, and it's a growing understanding of just how much the war was a cause of what we see today going on in the region. Now how did that come about? And by the way, I should say that on the Chilcot Report, and there have been all sorts of efforts to get quotes from anyone in the Pentagon. They're not saying anything about the report. They have no comment on this. No comment. And the report itself, well, we shouldn't say, it's not a grand expose. They say that this war was based on faulty intelligence and mistakes and lack of planning, and they were ill-prepared, all of those excuses for horrendous crime. But the war was such a disaster for U.S. and British imperialism, and the resistance was so powerful that really it became how to stop the resistance. And this is when the Sunni-Shia divide was created that has no history in Iraq and no history in Syria or anywhere in the region. But the conscious policy on every piece of ID, on every food subsidy that was given, on every ministry and government position was decided on the basis of allocating by religion, and then consciously using one force against another, as there was one mysterious explosion after another, which at the time, many forces in Iraq said this is the U.S. trying to set us against each other. There was an effort to resist this. But the sheer chaos that this unleashed did pull Iraq apart. They nevertheless were able to insist and demand on an end to U.S. troops in Iraq. There was a U.S. withdrawal, if you remember. And then the sheer level of violence and this Islamic State creation, you find the Iraqi government appealing to the U.S. for help to come back in to save them, these collaborators that they themselves had put in power. So we want to be aware of how this is used, and now it is a global phenomenon. But it didn't come out of the society in Iraq, or in Syria, or in Libya, or in Nigeria, or in Yemen, or any of the countries today where this is so much a force. Now, just in conclusion, I want to point out something else, because the FBI is today running hundreds and hundreds of really what are ISIS sting operations in the U.S. And it involves all kinds of, quote, sting operations of fake bomb makers from the FBI who are posing as, they're posing as ISIS recruiters online, and they're pushing for terror arrests that they themselves are creating, seeing who they can recruit, who's vulnerable, and then make a case and arrest and charge before any crime has actually taken place. There's a watch list that has been created. There's more than 1 million people on it. And it justifies greater and greater levels of repression and presents the state as a protective force, which it's not in any way whatsoever. There's increasingly detaining of ISIS suspects and all kinds of people who literally have no ties, and all sorts of fake plots. I don't want to go into all this, but I think everyone is very well familiar with this and just how dangerous it is. I'm going to skip really some of this because I think it's much more important we have time for discussion tonight. But let me just end by saying that we need to always, always come back to the role of U.S. imperialism. If we don't do that, we have no way of understanding what is going on in the world today. And it's not just, that's not just an artificial construct. Unless we understand this is the center of an empire, and they are willing to use every possible weapon, if we don't understand this, then we allow the workers here to get caught up in hating oppressed people. So it is a real weapon, our fighting this racism on a global scale, with solidarity and internationalism, and right here in the U.S. We want to always be in solidarity with the activists here that are on the front lines, and we want to try to link all the struggles together. Now, there's a demonstration this weekend against NATO. We're going to see how we can change that to talk about the expansion of U.S. military power abroad on a vicious scale, and at the same time talk about police violence right here, because that makes a living link in the struggle. It's the one thing that also allows the workers here to understand that they're not helpless. If we understand the problem and the root of the divisions and the task we face as revolutionary socialists, the fight against racism, national oppression, and building unity and solidarity, if we understand this, if we really grab a hold of it, then we have a weapon that can change history. And that's what we're fighting to do. Apart from our discussion tonight, I want to make a little orientation on the Republican National Convention coming up in Cleveland and the Democratic National Convention coming up in Philadelphia. Because the two bourgeois parties that are really the mainstay of how the U.S. administers the state are each in their own crisis. And in many ways, they have also lost the allegiance, a substantial number of working people here in the U.S. I mean, the largest number of people today, when they register to vote, register independent because they no longer feel even a loyalty to either party. Now picture the problem even that the RNC has with Donald Trump as their candidate. I mean, they have a convention of thousands of people and about 10,000 people from the media. And they have 4 to 5 hours of airtime, sort of nonstop for 4 days. And they're really worrying about how to even fill it. Like, you can picture some of the dregs that would be on the stage and what would be said and the problems it presents for them. But these conventions are also a magnet. There is a people's convergence that takes place at both conventions, which are thousands of young activists. There's a whole series of demonstrations and marches and activities in both Cleveland and then in Philadelphia. And in Philadelphia, for months around the country, Bernie Sanders forces in almost every state had their own websites, their own Facebook, called March on the DNC, to sort of back up a Sanders candidacy. And that has now collapsed. I mean, there's some, I don't know, 1,400 or however many Sanders delegates, and they're going to go fight over a platform piece. You know, how this will go down, whether folks will come to Philadelphia angry or not. They reserved, I think it's FDR Park, just outside the convention center. We have a very important demonstration in Philadelphia, consciously organized by the party, socialism. And it is also in coordination with the Philadelphia Real Justice campaign, which is a Black Lives Matter group, which is talking about police violence and killings in Philadelphia and the struggle against racism. And they're marching to our march, to the Workers' World March. That's a very important thing. That's Tuesday the 26th. I hope everyone here will at least be able to go to Philadelphia for that. It's one day. We'll be driving down. We'll have people in Cleveland from throughout the Midwest, coming up from Durham and many other places. And they face a whole series of problems, because just as we're talking about the state on another level, and the secret police and intelligence networks and homeland security, they're really operating in a big way to try to unravel the demonstrations in Cleveland, canceling permits, telling people who can march, who can't, moving sites of conference, trying to put it on the, I won't go into the geography of this, but the west side of Cleveland, you can only access the arena over bridges, which are very easy to close down. So they're trying hard to literally move everything over there, whereas it was in the downtown, everything was organized in the downtown, actually near the RNC. They're trying to get churches and community centers to cancel what has been in place for months. So they're working overtime to try to create divisions. We've issued a very important statement for unity and solidarity, a pledge that we're trying to get every group to sign in Cleveland, because always the media will go to wanting one group to attack the, quote, violence of another group, to have the anti-Trump forces fighting each other. And how do you stop that is you head it off in advance, and you try to alert people and get them to sign this unity and solidarity pledge. So there's a lot of political roles that we have. We're also having an important Workers' World meeting in Cleveland, where Monica and Lamont and Teresa, Larry, others will all be there, along with the demonstration, along with the role in the workshop and some other things going on. But while doing this, and under difficult, very difficult sort of lack of housing, very difficult situation on the ground, we don't know what else is facing us. I mean, Ohio is a right to carry state, as they say, for white racists, not for black youth, not for Tamir Rice. But we need everyone who's not in Cleveland, and that will be from so many of the people here, to be on alert during that time, because we don't know what incidents, what problems, what trouble there might be. when you have the agencies of the state, and you have the right wing, and you have angry youth who want to struggle. So we may need emergency response here, and demonstrations and actions and immediate emails and press releases released. So I raise this so that everyone is really thinking about this next week. As this week we have people out of town, and it's a smaller meeting. That may be true for the next couple of weeks, and yet we want to continue to have resistance meetings right here. And as we saw tonight, where suddenly on less than 24 hours notice, there were thousands of people in the street and marching, and for hours, we don't know what's unfolding in the days ahead. So more to be continued, but let's really have our eyes and ears, our political consciousness on the alert. This was important points raised tonight in the struggle here, and how we can be a force far beyond our size, with political ideas, with a combative approach, with slogans that change an issue. I mean, really, in Cleveland, until we released a statement, shut down Trump and the RNC, and to fight racism, Islamophobia, attacks on LGBT and Muslim people, that changed the message of other groups who had actually put out really kind of, and it's fine, religious groups were having a circle of love and calling for peace and justice and all of that. But how do we sharpen the message? And so we may have very small forces in Cleveland, but with what we had, and with the party as a whole getting behind it, and allies and other organizations, we've been able to have an impact in that message too. And an impact with the youth who aren't part of organized demonstrations. They have their own plans. And we want to be aware of that too. But we don't want any of them raided or rounded up or set up by the police agencies. So, at any rate, there's more to come on this, but we just do want to be asking everyone to be kind of on the alert, and we'll move forward together. But the final point, hopefully everyone here will be able at least to go to Philadelphia, many, of course based on work schedule and all of that, but to Philadelphia on July 26th. It's the anniversary of the Cuban Revolution. It's a very good day to be a revolutionary force, to talk about revolutionary socialism and the kind of fight and struggle that it takes, and to be in Philadelphia at the DNC. So